here. I'm here today to do my spoiler review for the book 1984 by George Orwell. This book I would consider both science fiction and speculative fiction. Speculative fiction being something I really enjoy reading, but I haven't been reading as much lately, and so I kind of went back and got a few modern classics that I know are considered speculative fiction, science fiction with dystopian twists, and I went to town on them, and this is the one I'm going to review for you guys. The story itself, I think, is kind of considered a modern classic. It's really well known, and I would honestly be surprised if anybody watching the channel hasn't really heard of it, or at least heard the concept of it. The story itself follows Winston. He is a worker for the party. He works in the Ministry of Truth, kind of editing history. They're rewriting history as necessary to make their leaders seem unimpeachable and perfect, kind of static in the way that God is unimpeachable and perfect. Winston himself is becoming more and more disillusioned with his life, with his government, with his job, and how everything is going, and it's causing him to, I guess, question reality a little bit. But over the course of the book, he meets Julia, they fall in love, and within that, when the opportunity arises, they kind of get involved in what they see as the resistance, and it's kind of them spiraling out of their normal lives within this. They meet with an end that to me feels a lot worse than if they had just died, just because of their complete loss of individualism and just like the tweaking of their humanity. So with that being said, I'm gonna move on to my 3 likes and 3 dislikes. As normal, my first like is the plot. I found it very interesting. I found the grim tones very intriguing, and it really pulled me in. And the tones themselves really allowed for this both subtle and not subtle hints and warnings within the message about government control and government overreach. My second like is the world building. You didn't have to do a lot of it. It was based kind of in our own general world, but he did have to explain how new alliances and new country borders, and they did talk about what life is like within the party, what the different cultures are with the party members and the proletariats, and just kind of, they did discuss things through the everyday life of the worker without doing too many info dumps, which was really nice, and it gave you a good sense of what the world was like at the point the story was taking place. And my third like was the pacing. It was slower in places, but I found that when it was slower, it was a lot more effective at emphasizing what the character is going through, because when Winston's anticipating meetings, I find the pacing was a bit slower, but I felt like that built the anticipation, or sometimes the pacing was a little bit more increased, and I found that usually emphasized the more action-filled parts, and I didn't feel like any of it was dragging or choppy, because the transitions of the pacing speeds was pretty effective and pretty fluid, just with how it was written and how the situations were transitioning. Moving on to my dislikes, I have 3 again. The first one is the writing style. This is something that I had a really hard time figuring out how to word it. There was something off about the writing, even though I found the pacing and the world building and the plot itself good. Just the technical writing felt a little bit off to me. And in the course of reading a few other reviews to get an idea of how to word it, I found a review that worded it rather well. And they had mentioned that it felt a lot more like an essay than storytelling, and I have to agree. It was a little bit drier. It definitely felt a lot more like a factual relating of a situation, as opposed to the storytelling vibe that you can get with a lot of books. And because that lack of storytelling, I think, is what made it a little bit harder for me to get into this time. And because of that, it just felt a lot drier to read, which isn't a big deal, but it did kind of hinder my enjoyment of certain parts of the book because of the dryness of the wording. My second dislike was kind of the naivete of the main characters. They go on and on about how Big Brother and the government are always watching, and thought police are a big issue. And then they think they're sneaking around, and it's just, I don't know how to explain that I didn't like it, other than that it disappointed me a little bit that the characters were that naive in that their actions weren't being monitored, or that they could get around them being monitored, given that there's this entire lack of privacy and individualism with this government. I just didn't care for it. I don't know what else to say. My third dislike was the idea that a woman is kind of like the harbinger of change for this main male character. I recently read Fahrenheit 451, and it had the same kind of thing. This young woman who's described as being beautiful and wonderful and intriguing and mysterious. Actually, I have it right here, yeah. Fahrenheit 451, and I think there was another one, but the name is escaping me. And this is one of the more problematic things that I don't care for in this book anymore. It just feels weird and kind of icky. It bugs me that they have a young, pretty woman leading the character astray from what the government wants, and it just seems very odd that even though they were discontent before, it required the appearance of this woman in their life to force them to go forward with it. Yeah, I didn't like that women were used as that kind of plot device. It's irritating and kind of sexist. And with that, I am done with my likes and dislikes. I will move on with my characters. You have your main character, Winston. He is a worker for the Ministry of Truth within the party, which is the government that's in power. I found him not to be particularly relatable, although at certain points in the novel I did feel sympathy for him. A lot of that came at the end of the novel, although I believe the consequences were well justified in the eyes of the government that you are reading about. I still felt bad for the level of violence against him. Next was Julia. She's the love interest. She is perceived as being what women in the party are expected to be. She appears to be hyper vigilant. She appears to be law abiding. She works for another ministry, a different one than Winston works for, and she's not particularly relatable, although it's in a slightly different way than Winston. And within that, she's also different in that she is young enough that she didn't grow up without the party influence, and so it was really interesting to read about their conversations where Winston would tell her kind of how things existed before the party were there, but she was just like, oh no, like the party did this. And it was a very strange contrast of being against the party but being raised by them. So there were certain beliefs where it was so ingrained and she had no other information or explanation for it, that she just accepted what they said. And it made for a very interesting read for her character. I did find both characters pretty flat. They didn't really develop too much, and although I feel like this really highlights the message, like the idea of lack of individualism because of the total control of the government, I'm a character person, so I generally prefer to have a more relatable character, so I did not enjoy the characters in this novel as much as I did characters in other novels. And that's all I have to say about my characters. Moving into my wrap up, I really struggled to figure out a rating for the book this time around. My enjoyment level wasn't as high as it has been with previous reads, and that's because I found a lot of things a little bit more problematic. This is something I grew up reading a lot through my young teen and late teen years. So having reread it again as an adult, I'm finding a lot of things like the description of women, the use of women as a specific plot device that I find to be sexist, and the writing style overall I found just really began to overpower my likes of the novel. And because of that, I'm going to end up giving the book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's still enjoyable. I will probably read it again just because I feel like the message is important and something to keep in mind, and it helps keep my mind open politically, in that regardless of right-wing or left-wing, I don't think a dictatorship with such total control of the population is going to be healthy or good. And within that, I do enjoy that part of the plot, that message. And although I do enjoy the world building, the pacing, on top of it, my dislikes, like I said, just really did begin to overpower it for the reasons I stated earlier. And that's all I really have to say about the book. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.